As the bustling airport prepared for yet another routine flight, Samantha Carter, a diligent and rule-abiding flight attendant, adjusted her uniform and checked her final preparations. She had been in this job long enough to know that efficiency and adherence to protocol were key. The airline had strict guidelines for everything: safety, service, and even meal distribution. The flight was nearly at capacity, and Samantha, like always, was prepared to ensure things ran smoothly. What she didn't know was that within moments, a single passenger request would unravel everything she thought she knew about her job. About compassion, and about the fragile balance between corporate rules and human needs. As passengers settled into their seats, David Langley, a weary traveler in his late 50s, buckled his seatbelt and adjusted his posture. Already feeling the discomfort of the hours ahead, his face was pale, his movements slow. He wasn't just another passenger. David was battling stage 4 cancer. The trip wasn't a vacation or a business meeting. It was another round of exhausting treatment that he had no choice but to endure. His body had changed drastically in the past year, and something as simple as eating had become a challenge. Certain foods triggered nausea, others were impossible to digest, and without the right meal, he would spend the flight battling sickness instead of resting. When Samantha reached David's row, he politely stopped her with a weak but hopeful smile. "Excuse me, miss, I pre-ordered a special meal. Something light, just something I can digest without trouble." His voice was steady but tinged with exhaustion, as though every word took effort. Samantha paused, scanning her list quickly. The meal distribution had to follow strict guidelines. Pre-ordered meals were reserved, and there was little flexibility to make last-minute changes. She skimmed over the passenger meal requests, furrowing her brow when she didn't see David's name listed under any special accommodations. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, maintaining her professional tone. "I don't see any special meal request for you in our system." David's stomach dropped. He knew he had ordered it, he always did. His doctor had made it clear that he needed to be careful with his diet. And traveling made it even more difficult to manage his condition. "There must be some mistake," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I can't eat the regular meals. My condition," he hesitated. He hated having to explain it, to reduce himself to a medical case rather than a person. "I have cancer. I physically can't eat certain foods. Please, is there anything at all that would work?" Samantha shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't heartless, but she was trained to follow the rules. The airline didn't allow changes unless they were confirmed in advance. If she gave him one of the few remaining special meals, she might be taking food from another passenger who had ordered it properly. She had dealt with countless requests before, some genuine, some from passengers trying to manipulate the system. In her mind, this was just another case of someone asking for an exception. "I'm really sorry," she said again, softer this time. "I wish I could help, but these meals are strictly pre-assigned. I have to follow the guidelines." David swallowed hard, frustration tightening in his chest. It wasn't just about hunger. It was about dignity. He wasn't asking for luxury or indulgence, just something that wouldn't make him suffer. And now, with his body already fragile, he would have to sit through this flight knowing that a simple act of nourishment was out of his reach. His hands gripped the armrests as he took a slow breath. "So, there's nothing you can do?" His voice wavered, the weight of his illness pressing down harder than usual. Samantha hesitated. For a moment, she wanted to break the rules, to dig through the carts and find something, anything, that wouldn't make this man's journey harder than it already was. But her training, the airline's strict policies, and the fear of doing something wrong held her back. "I wish I could, but..." David nodded, but it wasn't in acceptance, it was in defeat. His lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze dropping to his lap. The humiliation burned deeper than he expected. A grown man, a man who had endured months of chemotherapy, who had fought through pain most people couldn't imagine, was now sitting in a cramped airplane seat, being told he couldn't have something as simple as a meal that wouldn't make him sick. The passengers around them had noticed. A woman across the aisle exchanged a concerned glance with her seatmate. A few murmurs rose as sympathetic eyes turned toward David, and suddenly, the energy in the cabin shifted. The tension spread, rippling outward, turning the quiet hum of pre-flight routines into an uneasy silence. Samantha could feel the shift. She wasn't a stranger to uncomfortable passenger interactions, but this one was different. This wasn't just a request, it was a plea. And now, with so many watching, she realized that the moment was slipping out of her control. David exhaled shakily, muttering under his breath, "I just don't understand why kindness has to follow a rule." The words hit harder than he intended, and Samantha felt them settle into the pit of her stomach like lead. But before she could respond, before she could even process what had just happened, the situation had already spiraled. Another flight attendant had overheard. Within minutes, whispers traveled up the aisles. A supervisor appeared, and suddenly, Samantha wasn't just dealing with one unhappy passenger, she was facing scrutiny from all angles. Passengers whispered in hushed voices. Someone in the back pulled out their phone. Social media posts were being crafted in real time. And before Samantha could even comprehend the weight of what had just happened, she felt a hand on her shoulder. "We need to talk," the supervisor said, his voice clipped, his expression unreadable. The 6 minutes that followed would change Samantha's life forever. And she had no idea that she had just stepped into the center of a storm that wouldn't just take her job, but ignite a conversation far bigger than herself. Samantha Carter had always believed in following the rules. In her years as a flight attendant, she had been trained to handle turbulence, emergencies, unruly passengers, and even life-threatening situations. But what she wasn't prepared for, what no amount of training could have possibly taught her, was how 6 minutes could unravel her entire life. It started as a simple interaction. A man, pale, weak, fighting a silent battle with cancer, had requested a meal that he could actually eat without discomfort. A small request, a necessary request, a request that, had it been granted, would have changed nothing for the airline but everything for him. But Samantha had refused. She hadn't meant to be cruel. She had simply followed the protocols drilled into her for years. The rules were clear. Meals had to be pre-ordered. Exceptions were not to be made. And flight attendants were not to question the system. But as she walked away from the passenger, she felt something off. It wasn't just the way his shoulders sagged in defeat. It wasn't just the way the surrounding passengers had gone silent, their eyes darting between the two of them, judging her in a way she had never felt before. It was something more. Then the whispers began. A woman a few rows behind muttered, "Did she really just say no?" Another passenger leaned over to his wife. "He has cancer. Couldn't she just?" It spread like wildfire. The energy in the cabin changed. And as Samantha continued down the aisle, a feeling of impending doom settled in her chest. She had made a mistake. She knew it now. But before she could turn back, before she could even think of correcting it, her radio crackled in her earpiece. "Carter, supervisor wants to see you." Now, her breath caught. This wasn't normal. Supervisors didn't call flight attendants mid-service. If there was an issue, it was handled discreetly. This felt different. She turned, heart pounding, eyes scanning the cabin as if looking for an escape. The passenger, David Langley, was now staring at his tray table. Unmoving, a part of her wanted to run back to him, to apologize, to say, "Wait, let me fix this," but it was too late. Because a moment later, Paul Sanders, the airline supervisor, stepped into view. Paul had been with the airline for nearly 2 decades. A company man through and through. He had seen it all: customer complaints, emergency landings, lawsuits, PR nightmares. His job wasn't to ask questions. His job was to keep the airline's reputation intact. And in that moment, as he fixed cold, unreadable eyes on Samantha, she knew she wasn't getting out of this. "Step aside," Paul ordered, his voice clipped, devoid of emotion. Passengers fell silent. Every eye was now on her. Heat crept up Samantha's neck as she followed him toward the galley, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her mind raced. Maybe it's just a warning. Maybe they'll just tell me to be more careful. But deep down, in the pit of her stomach, she knew better. Paul didn't waste time. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't care about what she had been trained to do. "You handled that poorly," he said bluntly. "Do you realize how bad this looks?" Samantha swallowed. I was following protocol. The meals." Paul cut her off with a sharp glare. "That man has cancer, Carter." His voice was low but firm. "And you just denied him a basic human necessity. Do you understand how that's going to play out once this flight lands?" Samantha opened her mouth. No words came out. Because she did understand. Passengers had witnessed the exchange. Someone had already tweeted about it. She was sure of it. The world was watching. And suddenly, the truth sank in. The airline wasn't worried about the passengers' well-being. They were worried about their reputation. Paul exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple. The decision's been made. The finality in his voice made Samantha's stomach drop. What do you mean? She stammered. His eyes were ice. You're done, Carter. Her breath hitched. You're firing me? Over this? It's already been sent through corporate, Paul said, detached. They don't want this blowing up in the media. If we don't act now, this becomes a bigger problem. We have to send a message that we take customer concerns seriously. A lump formed in Samantha's throat. Panic, anger, disbelief. She wasn't a bad employee. She had never been written up. She had dedicated years to this job, sacrificing time, sleep, and so much more. And now she was being thrown out like she was nothing. For a moment, she considered fighting back, but then she saw Paul's face. This wasn't a discussion. This was the end. A 6-minute mistake had just erased everything. Her hands trembled as she removed her name tag. Her entire career reduced to a single moment of misjudgment. Paul didn't offer words of comfort. He didn't say I'm sorry. He didn't tell her that this was unfair. Because he didn't care. Samantha walked back down the aisle. Her steps heavy. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Passengers watched. Some whispered. Others simply looked away. She had followed the rules. But in the end, the rules hadn't protected her. They had betrayed her. And as she stepped off the plane for the last time, the real nightmare began. Because what had started as a routine flight was about to explode into a national scandal. And Samantha Carter was about to become the most hated, or most defended, woman on the internet. As Samantha Carter walked through the terminal, her head low, her uniform feeling tighter around her throat than ever before, she could hear the distant echoes of murmurs. She wasn't invisible anymore. People were talking, whispering, judging. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a scandal. It had only been minutes since she was dismissed mid-flight. Minutes since she had been humiliated in front of passengers who had once barely noticed her presence. Now, everything felt surreal, as though she had stepped into a world where reality blurred with nightmare. She pulled out her phone, hands shaking as she scrolled through the first few notifications. Her name was already on social media. And worse, it wasn't just her name. Her face was there too. Someone on the flight had taken a picture of her as she walked away from the passenger. Her posture rigid, her face unreadable. The caption beneath it made her stomach turn to ice. This flight attendant just refused to help a cancer patient because rules matter more than human decency. At airline official, is this your idea of good service? The post had thousands of shares already. Comments poured in like a tidal wave, flooding every corner of the internet. This is disgusting. Airlines have no compassion. I hope she gets fired. Oh wait, she already did. Good riddance. That poor man. I can't believe she just walked away. Samantha's breath came in short, shallow gasps. She wanted to respond, to explain herself, to beg for understanding, but she knew the internet wasn't a place for nuance. No one wanted an explanation. They wanted someone to blame. The man she had denied, David Langley, hadn't even spoken out yet. He had been quiet after the incident, sitting stiffly in his seat, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. He hadn't asked for this. He never wanted this. And yet, here they were, both of them at the center of a storm they hadn't seen coming. The media firestorm. The first news article hit an hour later. Flight attendant fired midair after denying meal to cancer patient. The headline was everywhere. The story spread faster than Samantha could process it. By the time she reached her apartment, her phone was ringing non-stop. Unknown caller. Unknown caller. Voicemail from mom. Samantha. I just saw the news. Call me, sweetheart. She finally answered one of the calls. Miss Carter? This is Mark Withers from Channel 7 News. We'd love to get your side of the story. The world wants to know, why did you refuse to help a sick passenger? Samantha couldn't breathe. She hung up, blocked the number. Then came the emails, the messages. Some were kind, from former colleagues who were just as shocked as she was. Sam, I know you. You would never hurt someone on purpose. I hope you're okay. But then there were the others. The ones that burned. You're a heartless monster. I hope you never get another job in your life. People like you don't deserve second chances. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest. Had she really done something this horrible? She replayed the moment in her mind, over and over, trying to find the moment she could have changed everything. Had she misjudged the situation that badly? Had she been so blind to what David needed? Her job had trained her to follow procedures, to be firm yet polite, to uphold the airline's policies. But now, none of that mattered. The world had already decided. She was a villain. David speaks out. 3 days after the flight, Samantha woke up to another explosion of headlines. David Langley had spoken. "I never wanted her to lose her job," he said in an exclusive interview. "I just wanted to eat something without getting sick." David had been tracked down by the media, and though he had been reluctant to speak, the pressure had finally forced him to. His words were simple, direct, and filled with disappointment. "I didn't want to cause a scene," David continued, his voice quiet. "I just hoped someone would listen. And when she didn't, it just made me feel invisible. Like my illness wasn't real." Samantha felt something inside her break. She had been so caught up in the rules, the protocol, the fear of making a mistake, that she had forgotten the most basic thing she had sworn to do as a flight attendant: take care of people. She had failed. And now, no matter how much she wanted to turn back time, the damage was done. The public demands action. The airline was under fire. People were calling for policy changes, for more training, for airlines to actually care about their passengers instead of just protecting their bottom line. A petition surfaced online. "Protect patients like David. Airlines must have more compassion." It gained 100,000 signatures in 24 hours. The airline scrambled to contain the damage. They issued a statement trying to balance their position. "We deeply regret the unfortunate misunderstanding on Flight 672. Our employees follow strict guidelines. But we recognize that flexibility and empathy must play a role in customer service. We are reviewing our policies to ensure future passengers receive the care they deserve." No apology. Not to David. Not to Samantha. Just a PR move to quiet the noise. Samantha watched the news that night, her hands clenched in her lap. She had never felt so powerless. She was out of a job. Her name was tarnished. And yet, she wasn't the only victim here. David, the man who had just wanted a meal, had been thrust into a public fight he never asked for. She wished she could tell him she was sorry. She wished she could take it all back. But regret didn't undo damage. And as the world debated, as news anchors yelled over each other, as social media flooded with opinions, one thought refused to leave Samantha's mind. What happens now? Because once the world turned against you, how do you come back? Samantha Carter sat in her dimly lit apartment, the glow of her phone screen illuminating her face. She was afraid to look. But how could she not? The world had already decided who she was. A villain. A heartless, robotic flight attendant who had denied a dying man a meal and walked away as if he were nothing. The notifications never stopped. Every few seconds, a new comment, another article, another video dissecting the incident. Her hands trembled as she scrolled, her breath coming in shallow gasps. How could she be so cruel? I hope she never works again. This is what's wrong with airlines today. No humanity. Just rules. But then, something unexpected. A new wave of comments. Different ones. Wasn't this the airline's fault? Why didn't they have a backup plan? This poor woman got thrown under the bus. It's obvious they fired her to cover themselves. The real problem here is how these companies don't care about their employees or their customers. Samantha blinked. She scrolled faster. The tide was shifting. Somewhere, someone had started asking the right questions. Had she really been the only one to blame? A nation divided. The debate ignites. The airline, thinking it had washed its hands of the controversy, had made a terrible mistake. By firing Samantha so quickly, they had created a new villain, and it wasn't her anymore. It was them. News anchors debated the situation. Some condemned Samantha, repeating the same story. A flight attendant refused to help a cancer patient. Others, however, began to peel back the layers. Why did the airline not have a better policy for medical needs? Why was a flight attendant held responsible for something that should have been a corporate issue? Did they fire her to save their own reputation? The airline had expected silence. Instead, they got a movement. Outrage swelled. What started as a scandal against Samantha became something bigger. A boycott campaign began trending online. #HoldAirlines accountable. #humanity over policies. People weren't just angry at one flight attendant anymore. They were angry at the entire corporate machine that had made the rules she was forced to follow. Airline unions spoke out, saying flight attendants were overworked, undertrained for these situations, and forced to follow policies that left no room for humanity. Former airline employees rallied behind Samantha, sharing their own horror stories. I was once written up for giving a passenger an extra blanket. I got reprimanded for giving a bottle of water to a diabetic passenger because they hadn't purchased one. These rules are meant to protect the airline, not the people. Samantha was no longer alone. The airline scrambles to control the damage. Within 48 hours, the airline was in chaos. Their stock price dipped. News headlines grew harsher. People were canceling flights. And then, the passengers from Samantha's flight started speaking out. One by one, they described what they saw. A woman who had been sitting 2 rows away gave an emotional interview. She looked torn. I could tell she wanted to help. I think she was just scared. She didn't know what she was allowed to do. A man who had been watching from across the aisle added, "The whole thing happened so fast. She was just doing what she was trained to do. I don't think she deserved to be fired." The narrative was changing. The airline panicked. They issued a new statement. "While we stand by our commitment to customer service, we regret the way this situation was handled and will be reviewing our policies to better serve passengers with medical conditions." No apology to Samantha. No attempt to make things right. Just a corporate response that felt empty. The public wasn't buying it. A voice from the shadows. Samantha speaks. For days, Samantha had stayed silent. She had wanted to disappear, to let the world forget her name. But now, she realized something. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every worker who had been thrown away to protect a company's image. It was about every passenger who had ever been ignored when they needed help. It was about changing the system, before it happened again. So, on the 7th day after her firing, Samantha spoke out. She sat down in front of her phone, took a deep breath, and hit record. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." Her voice trembled, but she kept going. "I was just doing what I was told, what I was trained to do. But now I see, that wasn't good enough. And for that, I am so sorry." Her eyes filled with tears. But not for herself, for David. For every passenger who had ever been failed by a system that wasn't designed to care. But I wasn't the only one at fault. The real problem isn't me. It's the fact that airlines don't train us to make compassionate decisions. It's the fact that employees are too scared to step outside the rules. It's the fact that these policies exist in the first place. She swallowed hard. "I don't want revenge. I don't want sympathy. I just want things to change." She ended the video with a simple plea. If you believe companies should treat people with compassion, not just as policies, please share this. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again. Then, she posted it. And the world listened. A new beginning. The public stands with Samantha. Her video was viewed millions of times in just a few hours. Celebrities shared it. News stations played clips. People rallied around her. Samantha Carter was no longer the villain. She was a symbol of change, of humanity in a world that had forgotten how to care. And as she watched the overwhelming support pour in, something inside her shifted. She had lost her job, but she had found her voice. And this was just the beginning. Will you stand with her? If you believe companies should put people before policies, if you believe no worker should be thrown away to protect corporate reputations, if you believe compassion matters, then share this story. Like to support Samantha. Comment if you've ever seen injustice like this. And let's make sure no one is ever treated this way again. Because this isn't just Samantha's fight anymore. It's all of ours. Samantha Carter had lost her job. The internet had torn her apart, then built her back up. The airline had tried to wipe its hands clean of her, hoping the outrage would die down, hoping people would move on. But something unexpected happened. They didn't. What started as one incident on a routine flight had sparked a wildfire. And the flames weren't just about one meal or one flight attendant or one passenger anymore. They were about something bigger, something deeply broken. The world had woken up. People weren't just talking about Samantha. They were talking about every customer service worker who had ever been punished for following the rules. Every employee who had wanted to help but was afraid to step outside the lines. Every person who had ever felt small, invisible, unheard because some corporation cared more about policies than people. And for the first time, It wasn't just whispers in the background. It was a roar. The experts weigh in. Policies versus people. News outlets started inviting customer service experts, labor rights advocates, and corporate analysts to weigh in. The conversation shifted from, "Was Samantha wrong?" to, "How did we get here?" A former airline executive, now a whistleblower, came forward in an explosive interview. Airline policies are designed to protect the company first, not the employees. And certainly not the passengers. We train flight attendants to follow strict guidelines because the moment they make an exception, they open the company up to liability. If Samantha had broken the rule and another passenger complained that they didn't get the same treatment, the company could have faced a lawsuit. That's why these rules exist. Not for fairness, for protection. The words hit hard. It wasn't about efficiency. It wasn't about safety. It was about power. And the world was starting to see it. Airline unions spoke up next. A flight attendant with over a decade of experience revealed the shocking reality behind Samantha's situation. "Do you know what happens when we break protocol? We get written up. 1. Write-up. You're warned. 2. You're put on notice. 3. You're gone. Most of us don't even get a chance to explain. We follow the rules because we're afraid. Not because we don't care. We care so much it hurts." People felt that. Because it wasn't just flight attendants, it was every worker in a customer-facing job. Retail employees, nurses, waiters, hotel workers, they all started sharing their stories. #We were trained to say no. A movement begins. On social media, something incredible happened. A hashtag emerged. #We were trained to say no. Thousands of workers from all industries shared their own stories. A woman who worked in a luxury store wrote, "A single mom came in with her sick child. She begged to use our employee restroom because her kid was about to throw up. I wanted to help. I really did. But my manager told me if I let her, I'd be fired." #We were trained to say no. A nurse posted, "A man with no insurance came into the ER. He needed pain meds. My supervisor told me to refuse unless he could pay up front. I still think about him. I still feel sick about it." #We were trained to say no. A fast food worker admitted, "A homeless man had enough money for fries but asked for a cup of water. My boss said no. I gave it to him anyway and got written up." #We were trained to say no. It was bigger than one airline. It was everywhere. People weren't just upset about Samantha anymore. They were outraged by the system. The way corporations had turned human compassion into a liability. The way policies had been used to strip workers of their ability to do the right thing. The world was watching now. And companies were scared. The airline tries to save face. Realizing they were losing control of the narrative, the airline held a press conference. The CEO stood before a crowd of reporters, flanked by PR representatives who looked like they hadn't slept in days. "We recognize that this situation has raised important questions about corporate policies and customer service. We are committed to reviewing our training procedures to ensure more flexibility and compassion in future interactions." The statement was empty. People saw right through it. Because the real issue wasn't about training. It was about culture. It was about a system that taught workers to be afraid. A system that prioritized the bottom line over human decency. And the public wasn't letting it go. Samantha speaks again. A call for change. For days, Samantha had been watching in silence. She had been afraid that if she spoke out again, it would only make things worse. But now, she knew she had to. She sat down, pressed record, and spoke from the heart. "I never wanted any of this attention. But if this conversation is happening, then we had to do something with it." She took a deep breath, gathering her emotions. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. About every worker who has ever felt powerless. About every customer who has been let down by a system that doesn't care." She paused, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "We need change. Real change. Not another corporate apology. Not another PR stunt. We need to demand better. We need policies that allow workers to be human. We need companies to put people first." She looked straight into the camera. "If you've ever been in a situation like mine, if you've ever been told to say no when you knew in your heart you should have said yes, I want to hear your story. Comment below. Share this. Let's make them listen." She ended the video, posted it, and within hours, it had millions of views. The fight for something bigger. Samantha's story had started with one flight. One mistake. But now? It was a movement. The world was no longer talking about one airline. They were talking about every industry that treated workers like robots. Every company that had trained employees to ignore their instincts. Samantha had lost her job. But she had found her purpose. And now, she wasn't fighting alone. The question was, would you stand with her? Would you demand better? If you believe companies should put people before policies, comment below. If you believe workers should be empowered, not punished, share this story. If you've ever been in a situation like Samantha's, tell your story. Because this fight? It's not just hers anymore. It's all of ours. Samantha Carter had lost her job, her dignity, and for a while, even her sense of purpose. The days after her firing had felt like walking through a storm with no shelter. Each headline another gust of wind tearing at her. She had been the villain, then the victim, and now, somehow, she was becoming something she never expected. A voice, not just for herself, for every worker who had been forced to choose between rules and humanity. For every passenger who had been made to feel like their struggles didn't matter. And she wasn't doing it alone. David Langley, the man whose meal request had started it all, was standing beside her. He could have walked away from the entire situation. He could have let the world fight for him while he focused on his health. But David wasn't the type to turn his back on something that mattered. He had spent too many nights in hospital beds, too many hours in waiting rooms, too many moments fighting for the simple dignity of being heard. He knew what it was like to be ignored, to be seen as an inconvenience rather than a person. So when the media reached out to him, when journalists begged for more fuel for their headlines, David chose a different path. He didn't condemn Samantha. He didn't paint her as heartless. Instead, he told the truth. I don't blame her. I never did. She was just another person caught in a system that doesn't leave room for kindness. His words shattered expectations. The world had been waiting for him to take a side, to call for Samantha's permanent cancellation or demand revenge against the airline. But he did neither. Instead, he turned the conversation from blame to change. The first step toward change. David reached out to Samantha first. Not through a TV interview. Not through a staged event. A simple email. Samantha, I know this has been hell for you. It has been for me, too. But I think we can do something with this. I think we can make this mean something. If you're willing to talk, I'd like to meet. Samantha had stared at the email for an hour before replying. She wasn't sure she deserved his kindness. She wasn't sure she deserved anything. But she knew one thing. She couldn't run from this forever. So she said yes. When they met, it was nothing like what she had imagined. There was no tension, no anger, no resentment, just two people, sitting across from each other, carrying the weight of the same story but from two different sides. David spoke first. I don't want to fight the airline for an apology. I want to fight so this doesn't happen to someone else. Samantha felt something shift in her chest. She had spent so long feeling helpless, feeling like she had no control over what happened to her. But this was something she could do. This was a fight worth fighting. And from that moment, they weren't just former strangers on opposite sides of an unfortunate event. They were partners in change. The movement begins. Together, they launched the Human First Initiative, a movement dedicated to fighting for compassionate corporate policies. Especially for customers with medical conditions and workers who had been stripped of the ability to help them. They started small. A petition demanding policy changes in airlines to ensure that passengers with medical conditions could get proper accommodations without bureaucracy standing in the way. It gained 100,000 signatures in the first week. Then, they held a live Q&A, where people could ask questions, not just about the flight incident, but about how companies needed to do better. The live stream had millions of views. People resonated with their message, not because it was about revenge, but because it was about redemption. For too long, customers had felt like just another ticket number. For too long, employees had been forced to ignore their instincts. Now, there was finally a voice speaking for both. And people were listening. The airline's response, and the public's verdict. The airline had hoped the story would die down. It didn't, because David and Samantha wouldn't let it. They started reaching out to other airline employees, gathering stories, collecting testimonies of passengers who had been denied basic accommodations because of policy loopholes. And when the airline finally addressed it, their response was too little, too late. We recognize the concerns raised and are working on an internal review of our procedures. It was corporate speak for, "We hope you forget about this soon." But people weren't forgetting. Because now, it wasn't just about Samantha and David. It was about every person who had ever been led down by a system that cared more about profit than people. And as their movement gained momentum, Samantha realized something. For the first time since she had been fired, she didn't feel powerless. She didn't feel like a villain. She felt like she had a purpose. A call to action. Your voice matters. This isn't just a story about one flight. It's about every customer who has ever been treated like a problem. It's about every employee who has ever been punished for showing kindness. And now, it's about you. If you believe companies should put people first, comment below. If you've ever been in a situation where rules stopped you from doing what was right, share your story. If you want to stand with Samantha and David in demanding change, let your voice be heard. Because this isn't just their fight anymore. It's all of ours. And together, we can change the way the world treats people. This version adds deep emotional connection, showing Samantha's transformation from guilt to advocacy and David's resilience in using his voice for change. It calls on listeners to get involved, ensuring they stay engaged until the end. Would you like any more details or dramatic enhancements? The pressure had been building for weeks. At first, the airline had tried to ignore it, hoping the outrage would be fleeting. Then, they tried damage control, a cold, empty statement about policy reviews and internal training. But this time, it wasn't enough, because the people weren't backing down. Samantha Carter and David Langley's story had grown too big. The internet was relentless. News stations wouldn't let it go. And now, it wasn't just about one airline. It was about an entire industry that had long treated passengers like numbers and employees like replaceable gears in a machine. And under the crushing weight of public scrutiny, the airline industry was finally forced to respond. The airline's last attempt to save face. A press conference was scheduled, the first real one since the scandal began. The CEO, a man who had spent years carefully crafting a brand of trust and loyalty, now stood before flashing cameras, his carefully rehearsed words trembling under the weight of what was at stake. Behind him, a banner displayed the airline's slogan, one that now felt like a joke to the public. "We put passengers first." The hypocrisy hung in the air. The room was silent as he stepped up to the podium. He cleared his throat, scanning the sea of reporters who had been waiting for this moment, waiting for answers. "We at airline name deeply regret the events that took place on Flight 672. We acknowledge that in certain circumstances, our policies have been too rigid, and we are committed to ensuring that all passengers, especially those with medical conditions, receive the care and respect they deserve." The vague words barely touched the surface of the damage. The journalists weren't buying it. A hand shot up. "Does this mean you're reinstating Samantha Carter?" The CEO paused. "At this time, we are reviewing all aspects of this situation, including employee policies and training programs." No direct answer. No accountability. Just another corporate script meant to smooth things over. But the world wasn't looking for polished words. They were looking for change. The industry-wide impact. Other airlines take notice. The fallout was too big to contain. Rival airlines saw what was happening and knew that if they didn't act now, they'd be next. Some airlines took a different approach. Instead of waiting for their own scandal, they preemptively announced changes. Starting immediately, "We are revising our policies regarding passengers with medical conditions to ensure that no traveler is denied proper accommodations." Another major airline issued a public apology, even though they weren't involved in the incident. "We recognize that, as an industry, we have not always gotten it right. It's time to put compassion before policy." Some skeptics rolled their eyes. Was this real change, or just fear of the backlash? For passengers who had suffered similar indignities in silence, it didn't matter. For the first time, airlines were acknowledging that they had failed. And that was a step in the right direction. Employees speak out. The broken system is exposed. But the conversation wasn't just about passengers anymore. As more airlines scrambled to prove they were fixing the issue, flight attendants from around the world began speaking out. They had seen what happened to Samantha, and they had had enough. One anonymous flight attendant gave an interview that shook the industry to its core. "Do you know how many times I've been forced to say no to someone who needed help? Do you know how many times I've been written up for doing the right thing? We aren't trained to care, we're trained to comply. And if we step outside those lines, we lose our jobs, just like Samantha did. Another former employee, now free to speak, revealed the ugly truth behind corporate training. We're told to smile, to be polite, but we are not allowed to make decisions that go against policy. If a mother needs extra formula for her baby, no. If an elderly man needs a blanket but didn't book premium, no. If a cancer patient just wants a meal he can actually eat, no. Because at the end of the day, it's not about service. It's about protecting the company from lawsuits and maximizing profit. The truth was out. Passengers weren't just sympathizing anymore. They were angry. David Langley's final word, a plea for humanity. David Langley, whose quiet request for a meal had started this entire movement, had been watching it all unfold. The press, the corporations, the policies, the empty apologies and half-hearted promises. So, when he was invited to speak at a customer rights summit, he took the stage with no speech prepared. He didn't need one. I never wanted any of this. His voice was tired but strong. I never wanted Samantha to lose her job. I never wanted headlines or protests or corporate statements. He looked at the audience, his gaze steady and full of quiet pain. I just wanted to be treated like a human being. The room was silent. This isn't about me anymore. It's about the next person. The next passenger who will board a flight, hoping they won't have to beg for basic dignity. The next flight attendant who will be punished for showing kindness. He took a slow breath. And the question now isn't whether airlines will change. The question is, will we let them pretend this never happened? The audience rose to their feet. Thunderous applause filled the room. Because they knew the answer. A call to action. Your voice matters. This isn't just about one airline. This is about every industry that treats people like numbers. It's about every customer who has ever been made to feel unimportant. It's about every employee who has been forced to choose between their job and their conscience. And now, it's about you. If you believe companies should put people first, comment below. If you've ever been in a situation where policies came before compassion, share your story. If you want to stand with Samantha, David, and every worker and passenger who has ever felt powerless, make your voice heard. Because the world is watching. And we won't let them forget. This version evokes deep emotions, showing the public pressure, the industry's fear, and the rising movement for real change. It ends with a powerful call to action, making the listener feel personally involved in the fight. Would you like any additional dramatic elements? Samantha Carter had lost everything, or at least, that's what she had believed in those early, terrifying days after her firing. Her career, her dignity, her sense of self, all of it had been stripped away in a matter of minutes. She had gone from a dedicated flight attendant to a nationwide controversy. A name plastered across news headlines. Her face scrutinized by strangers who knew nothing about her beyond a single moment of misjudgment. But what she didn't know then, what she couldn't have possibly imagined, was that the worst moment of her life was actually the beginning of something much greater. Her story didn't end with disgrace. It didn't end with regret. It ended with change. And more importantly, it ended with hope. The road to redemption. Finding purpose after the storm. For weeks, Samantha had felt lost, even as the public's anger shifted from her to the airline, even as people rallied to her defense. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed. Not just herself, not just David Langley, but everyone who had ever looked to her for kindness and care. Her whole life, she had taken pride in her job. Being a flight attendant wasn't just about serving drinks and smiling, it was about helping people. It was about making sure that every passenger, no matter their background, no matter their struggles, felt safe, respected, and valued. And yet, in the moment that had mattered most, she had let a rule stop her from doing what was right. But Samantha wasn't the type of person to stay down forever. So when David Langley reached out, when he told her, "I think we can turn this into something good," she listened. And from that moment, everything changed. The birth of human-centered business, changing corporate culture. Samantha and David started small. A petition, a simple demand for airlines to implement more compassionate policies for passengers with medical conditions. It got 100,000 signatures in a week. Then, they held a live-streamed discussion, where workers and customers from all industries shared their own horror stories. It got millions of views. The momentum wasn't stopping. And soon, companies began to take notice. Samantha was invited to speak at corporate seminars. Her voice now one of expertise, not scandal. She shared what she had learned, how strict, outdated policies were hurting both employees and customers, how fear of punishment was preventing workers from making humane decisions, and how corporate greed was prioritizing efficiency over empathy. It wasn't just airlines. It was retail workers, forced to deny customers basic kindness because of rigid corporate rules. It was hospital staff, pressured to treat patients like numbers instead of people. It was restaurant servers, reprimanded for giving a hungry child an extra piece of bread without charging for it. Every industry had the same problem, and Samantha was determined to fix it. She co-founded a new movement, human-centered business, a mission dedicated to changing corporate culture from within, to retraining businesses to see their customers as people, not just transactions, to empowering employees to trust their instincts, instead of being afraid of breaking a rule. Her goal? To make sure no one else ever had to choose between their job and their humanity. And this time, people were listening. The airline industry's response, a step in the right direction. Samantha never expected an apology from the airline that had fired her. But she didn't need one. Because something better happened instead. Under immense pressure, the airline finally took action, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. They announced a complete overhaul of their customer service policies. More flexibility in meal accommodations. New guidelines for handling passengers with medical needs. And most importantly, new training for flight attendants, giving them the power to make judgment calls based on compassion. Not just corporate rules. Other airlines followed. Then hotels. Then restaurants. Then retail chains. The ripple effect had begun. And it all started with one mistake. One moment. One person who refused to let failure define her. Lessons from Samantha's story. What we can all learn. Samantha's journey isn't just her story. It's a lesson for all of us. Because at some point in life, we will all be faced with a choice. To follow a rule, even when it's wrong. Or to do what's right, even when it's hard. So if you ever find yourself in Samantha's shoes, remember this. Checkmark policies should never come before people. Rules are important, but when they dehumanize others, they need to be challenged. Checkmark fear should never control your actions. Samantha let her fear of breaking protocol cloud her judgment. Don't let fear stop you from doing the right thing. Checkmark second chances are real. You are not defined by your worst moment. You can grow, learn, and turn mistakes into opportunities. Checkmark you have a voice, use it. If something feels unfair or wrong, speak up. Advocate for change, because change only happens when people demand it. Checkmark empathy is everything. Whether you're a worker, a customer, or a leader, remember, kindness costs nothing, but it changes everything. Samantha's new life, a future filled with purpose. Years after the incident, Samantha no longer sees herself as the flight attendant who got fired. She sees herself as a leader, a teacher, an advocate for compassion in the workplace. She now travels the world, speaking at corporate events, training companies to lead with empathy, and helping workers find their voice when faced with impossible choices. She has never felt more fulfilled. And as she watches industries shift toward a more compassionate future, she knows it was all worth it. Now, it's your turn. Will you stand with Samantha? If you believe companies should put people first, comment below. If you've ever been in a situation where rules came before compassion, share your story. If you want to stand with Samantha and David in demanding change, make your voice heard. Because the world only changes when we refuse to accept the way things are. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this, subscribe to our channel. Because this isn't just Samantha's fight. It's all of ours. And together, we can change the world. This brings closure, offers real-life lessons, and calls on listeners to take action, ensuring the story lingers in their minds. Would you like any final touches or more dramatic moments to make the ending even more impactful?